Thank you, Adam. I'm very, very pleased today to have my friend James Shirk here to speak with us about the 3 executive orders of last year. James Shirk is Special Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy, where he has served since day 1 of the presidency, as far as I'm aware.
Day 2.
Okay, day 2. All right. So he's pretty new. His portfolio includes civil service reform and labor regulations. Prior to joining the administration, he was a research fellow in labor economics at the Heritage Foundation, where I was privileged to meet and work with James for several years. Mr. Shirk has a master's degree in economics from the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York, and also a graduate of Hillsdale College. I'm also pleased to say that James is my friend. You've got just a wonderful human being and a lovely family. Germane to today, aside from his portfolio, is the fact that James did work substantially on the executive orders today. So I think that he has a wealth of insight and information as to how these EOs were sort of conceived and developed, what they're intended to do, and I'll leave it to James to let us know. So thank you very much.
Right. Thanks so much, Andrew. I'll just speak from here rather than going up on the podium. Just feels a bit more natural while you guys are having lunch. If you guys were to flash back or rewind in time 3 years ago from now, then candidate Trump was on the campaign trail talking about how he was going to drain the swamp and reduce waste in government. The executive orders that were issued last May are part of fulfilling that campaign promise. Now, obviously, for this entire talk, I have to caveat things by saying there's an injunction. Large portions of these orders have been enjoined. Not all of them, but portions have been enjoined. The administration feels we have a very strong legal case here. We had oral arguments last month before the D.C. Circuit. We're hopeful and confident that the appellate court is going to lift that injunction, but that hasn't happened yet. So what I'm going to discuss is what the executive orders would do when they fully take effect. So I'm not going to just bounce around between tenses, but just talking in terms of what the orders would do when they take effect. Now, I can't discuss the White House deliberative process that produced these orders. Obviously, that's covered by executive privilege. But what I can discuss is the problems that these orders are addressing and how the orders go about fixing those problems. So there are 3 executive orders, and let's just go through them in turn. Executive Order 13839, the Streamlining Removals Executive Order, addresses a serious failure of the federal workforce to actually live up to the merit systems principles that Congress has called for. Most people don't know it, but merit systems principles say that federal employees should be held accountable for their conduct and for their performance, and if they're not, they should be removed. For example, merit systems principle number 6 states, and I'm quoting directly here, employees should be retained on the basis of the adequacy of their performance. Inadequate performance should be corrected, and employees should be separated who cannot or will not improve their performance to meet these required standards. End quote. Federal employees overwhelmingly believe this is not how the federal workforce operates. The Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, every year they survey the employees and they ask a question along these lines of how adequate a job does your agency do with managing poor performers and removing those who won't improve. Every year, it's less than 1/3 of federal employees say that their agency's response here is adequate. 2/3 of federal employees believe that this merit systems principle is not actually being carried out in their workforce. And there's plenty of examples of this. For example, at the Environmental Protection Agency, they were having a problem. They noticed that cameras and computers and other expensive technical equipment was disappearing from one of their regions. So they did a search. And they found a hit, actually, on some of their missing items in a pawn shop in Atlanta. And further investigation turned up that an employee had been taking agency equipment and pawning it off and keeping the proceeds for herself. She was caught, she pled guilty, she confessed, didn't deny her guilt, and had to pay thousands of dollars in fines. But the one thing that did not happen was her being fired from the federal service. EPA did not even try to fire her. Instead, they only proposed a 90-day suspension, which on appeal was reduced to a 30-day suspension. This is not the way the federal workforce should operate, and yet overwhelmingly it is. In last year, there were about 6,000 removals of employees who'd passed their probationary year, during which they're effectively at will. But once you get past that, about 6,000 removals, an entire 10-year federal workforce of about 1.8 million workers. That's a firing rate of less than 1/3 of 1%, which is dramatically lower than private sector termination rates. And so when Congress has said, don't do that, and common sense says, don't do that, Why are managers continuing to allow poor performers or employees who engage in even egregious misconduct to stay on the rolls? And the answer is, while Congress has said don't do that, they've created a system that makes living up to these principles somewhat difficult. Because if you're going to fire an employee for, say, poor performance, GAO had a good report that came out recently showing that if everything goes smoothly, it's going to be a 6-month to a 1-year process. And it could take a lot longer than that if things don't go smoothly. Well, if you're a manager, do you want to fight for 6 months to a year to fire one of your employees? You're paid to manage an agency. That's what you want to do. And that's what they do. And they allow, not every single manager, but many of them, the majority of them, decide to allow problem employees to slide unless they're just an overwhelming problem, because that becomes the path of least resistance. Now, part of this difficulty can be attributed to the statute that Congress has passed, but the vast majority, well, a substantial majority of it, can be attributed not so much to the statute, but to the regulatory accretions that have built up over it, the case law implementing it, the rules and the regulations and the procedures that follow around it. The president obviously cannot change the statute through an executive order, but what the streamlining removals order was aiming to do was just power wash off those regulatory barnacles to return to the statutory core Congress had passed, and actually make it easier for federal managers to live up to the requirements that the directives Congress has given them. Remove poor performers, remove bad employees. We should have a merit system. And so let's discuss 3 of the biggest changes the streamlining removals order made. It had a bunch. I'm not going to go into all of them here. Maybe we can discuss some in the Q&A. But one of the biggest ones was eliminating PIPs and eliminating PAPs and setting PIPs to 30 days. Some of you know what those terms mean. Most of you, I hope, do not. A PIP is something required under the Chapter 43 removal process. This was the centerpiece of the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. That Jimmy Carter was going to make it simple and easy for agencies to remove poor performers. But before you do that, before you fire someone for poor performance, okay, we're going to give them an opportunity to demonstrate acceptable performance, is the technical term. It is commonly known as a performance improvement period. And the agency cannot remove the employee until they've completed this PIP. And during that time, the manager has to work very extensively with the employee to get their performance up to speed. Now, for an agency, there's no real benefit to having a longer PIP, because once you start the process, if their performance relapses, you can always, within a year, remove them. So if you set the PIP at 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, all you're doing is saying you can't propose removal until the PIP is over. But there's no actual benefit to the agency of a longer PIP, because if their performance is bad after the PIP is over, you can still fire them if it's within a year. But by either agency policy or union contract, PIPs are typically 2 to 4 months long. And so that's 2 to 4 months of extensive work on the part of the manager, when if you've got someone whose performance is inadequate, you can't fire them. And that's if you're in an agency without a PAP. What is a PAP, you ask? A PAP is a performance assistance period. This is something that union contracts require. Before you can put them on the formal PIP, which is a legal predicate to firing them, you have to give them a PAP if you're in an agency that has one of these, like, for example, the Social Security Administration. And so the entire process that was designed to be simple and easy, it turned into anywhere from a 2 to a 6 month process before you propose removing them. No wonder managers aren't using this. And that's in addition to the time you need to build up your case and additional documentation on top of that. In fact, last year, and consistently year over year, less than 400 employees get removed on the basis of poor performance, using the Chapter 43 procedures. Centerpiece of the Civil Service Reform Act, and it's only being used 400 times a year, when federal employees themselves say that accountability is just a huge problem in the agencies. And so the executive order says, enough of this, we're going to make this a much easier process. Yes, you get an opportunity to demonstrate acceptable performance, but it's not 6 months. We will set the length of the PIP at 30 days. There will be no more PAPs, and it will become a much easier process for agencies to use. Now, a second problem that was addressed by the executive orders is the issue of how do you address performance and misconduct? Is it going to be an individualized determination, or do we impose uniform agency-wide standards? And this became necessary because of some doctrinal changes produced by the Obama-appointed Merit Systems Protection Board, where they decided that if you wanted to fire an employee, and let's say you've got someone who's engaged in misconduct, and you're trying to fire them, well, if anyone else in the agency has done something that they consider similar and hasn't been fired, you can't fire this guy either. You've got to have agency-wide comparators. The case that established this doctrine is almost unbelievable. but it's true. I had to read it myself a few times to believe what was going on. But the Transportation Security Administration oversees the Air Marshal program. For those of you who aren't familiar, they're basically undercover law enforcement officers who fly on flights so that if there's a hijacking or terrorist situation, they're armed, they can take down the terrorist. So it's a way of protecting flights from terrorist activity. Well, they had an air marshal assigned to fly out to Hawaii, cover a flight there, and then a flight back to the mainland the next day. And while he was there in his layover in Honolulu and waiting for the next day, he decided he wanted some recreational activities and decided to solicit a prostitute, who turned out to be an undercover police officer who arrested him for street solicitation. And he spent the next few days in jail. And as a result of that, he missed his return flight, and all of those passengers had no protection. What happened to this guy, you say? Well, TSA, to their credit, fired him. But when it got up to the Merit Citizens Protection Board, they said, whoa, not so fast here. No. Look at what happened over in Germany, where a different employee under totally different supervisors got into an altercation in a German brothel. Now, in Germany, prostitution is legal, and this guy didn't miss any of his flights, but they said, look, this guy got into an altercation in a German brothel. This guy got into an altercation here dealing with a, what he believed to be a prostitute in Hawaii. You showed leniency over here, you can't fire this guy over here. That's ludicrous. It is completely ludicrous. If you're a manager, how are you supposed to track what the agency-wide penalties are? Someone somewhere in the agency is going to show leniency in one case. There's always mitigating circumstances. That one guy who shows leniency has then established the maximum penalty that can be imposed for discipline agency-wide. This is why the post office had an employee who was literally arrested over her lunch break for doing drugs in the alley right next to the post office with cocaine in her possession, where it was determined she'd brought cocaine onto federal premises. And headline news, and they couldn't fire her because they'd had another employee somewhere else, way away from work, who had been caught smoking pot and wasn't fired. You establish leniency once on something that the MSPB thinks might be comparable, you're not firing anyone. I mean, good night. It's ridiculous. And so the executive order says, enough of this. We're going to establish that the action of a different supervisor supervising different employees doing different jobs is not going to limit the ability of another supervisor to take appropriate actions, and it's going to be individualized determinations based on the facts and the circumstances of the case. There may be circumstances with the same supervisor under the same work unit where it makes sense to look at comparators, but we're not requiring it, and it's certainly not going to be government-wide. I mean, imagine trying to be a supervisor taking care of a problem like this. Like if those were the rules, and you have no idea that somewhere in Germany, how are you supposed to understand this stuff? It's just completely crazy. Another thing the executive order takes on is the union grievance process. Grievance and arbitration is a very hostile forum for agencies in these removal cases. Agencies prevail much less commonly there than they do before the statutory processes like the EEOC or the Merit Citizens Protection Board. And if you ask the practitioners, why is this? The answer comes back because, in a sense, the arbitrators have been captured through the process. That the way arbitration works is both parties have a list of names of arbitrators submitted, and they strike one name off the list, other party strikes another name until you're left with one that both can agree on. Now, if you're an arbitrator who consistently rules for the agencies, even if that's what the law calls for, well, the unions have an internal database. They keep track of this. Agencies don't do it in the same way, but the unions do. And they're going to strike your name off the list first. And so if you want to be selected again as an arbitrator, I mean, that's how they make their money. If you want to be selected again, you know that the union has to consider you acceptable. And as a result, many arbitrators just bend over backwards to find a way to split the baby and avoid giving total victory or total defeat to either side. When you're dealing with an employee removal case, what does splitting the baby look like? Well, it means finding that the guy was guilty. Yes, agency, you were right to take action here. Oh, but removing him is too severe a penalty for this action. We can't do that. Let's give him a suspension instead. And you just get some ludicrous cases out of here. There was one decided not that long ago, where the Bureau of Prisons had a prison guard, federal law enforcement officer, who they had a random drug test, and he failed. His union insisted, oh, you can't just have the agency drug test. We want to give him a separate drug test ourselves. So he had a second-year analysis. The agency agreed to it, which he also failed. And so at that point, when you have a prison guard supervising people who are in jail for some of the actions he's committing, they fired him. And it went to an arbitrator. The union grieved. And the arbitrator agreed, yes, guilty as sin. This guy did everything the agency said, but you can't remove him for that. No. Only a 2-week suspension. Removing him for violating federal law as a federal law enforcement officer is just unacceptable. And that was that. And this is just, agencies should not have to deal with this. And so the order directs agencies to seek to remove removal cases from the grievance and arbitration process, to stick to the statutory procedures, which, again, there's areas of the case law like this agency-wide comparator stuff that need to be addressed, but in general provide a more consistent and reliable method of discipline than the union arbitration. And if we get the injunction lifted, I think these procedures are going to do great things for the American workforce, certainly fulfilling the president's campaign promises, and they're great news for federal employees. Because the people who suffer the most from poor performers are their fellow federal employees. One of my favorite statistics that came out of the entire debate over these EOs is one of the government executives, a magazine, they commissioned a survey of federal employees and asked, do you approve or disapprove of the president's executive order making it easier to fire poor performers? 2-to-1 support among the federal workforce. Because everyone works with that guy, Joe, in their office who does nothing but play solitaire all day. And the employees who are trying to serve the American people are sick and tired of it. And they're the ones telling Febs, we want those guys out of here. They're the ones responding to the survey saying we want them out of here. And the president is working with them to try and make the government actually work for the American people. The second executive order, EO 13836, addresses the issue of union contracts. The Obama administration gave some pretty sweet deals to the federal sector unions. You might call them sweetheart deals. That while the unions love them, we're not doing the best things for agency efficiency. Anything from just very generous grants of taxpayer-funded union time, which I'll talk about in a second, to these grievance processes that make it so hard to remove people. I don't know how much Jed got into in his talk. One of the major pain points for agencies has been the abuse of telework, where yes, we have a policy that favors telework, but these union contracts make it very hard to keep up with this. And so the order basically says agencies renegotiate your contracts and get a better deal for the American people. But not just, hey, do better, but also we're going to give you tools to do better. And so we created a labor relations working group so that the agencies can share information between themselves. Because right now the unions do that. AFG is pushing for very similar contract provisions across all their agencies. But the agencies don't coordinate. So if the Defense Department finds out that the AFG proposals are just horribly inefficient at defense, VA doesn't find out, Labor doesn't find out, Social Security Administration doesn't find out. Those guys negotiate in the dark if it turns out that these provisions, the arbitrators are just interpreting in a horrible way at defense. Well, now they're going to know. They're sharing information, they're sharing best practices, and regular coordination between the agencies, in much the same way that the unions do internally across their locals. Also, the order directs agencies to speed up the process. Any of you who've been involved know that this is a very long process. These contract negotiations literally take years and years and years. The Veterans Affairs contract, the contract they're currently under, they took 8 years to negotiate that. Their current contract, they reopened in November 2017. They just finished ground rules negotiations about a month ago. Education, I'm sure Jed told you, they spent over a year spinning their wheels trying to get ground rules. HHS just finished their contract, took them 4 years of negotiations. This is just ridiculous. Because the taxpayers are paying for everything. They're paying for the agency negotiators, of course, and for the union negotiators. Because under the law, the agencies pay for both sides negotiators. So the unions have no incentive to slow things down. And if they think they're not going to get a contract that's as good as the old one, they've got lots and lots of games they can play to make things take longer. And so the order basically says, agencies, enough of the games, we're going to short circuit this. Seek ground rules that set 6 months for negotiations, and after that, send everything to the presidentially appointed Federal Service Impasses Panel to determine. And if you can't get ground rules like that after about 6 weeks, also go and ask the Impasses Panel for good ground rules. And so 6 months is plenty of time for good faith negotiations. This is akin to what you'll see in private sector negotiations. Plenty of time to cover these contracts, but it's not going to be an 8-year taxpayer-funded multi-million-dollar marathon to do things like the VA contract. That is just a bad use of the American people's money. And if the injunction is lifted, I expect that we're not going to see too much more of that. Now, the third executive order, EO 13837, deals with the issue of taxpayer-funded union time. The unions prefer the name official time, but that actually covers a whole bunch of different things. And so we said, nope, for this specific thing is taxpayer-funded union time. The law actually allows federal employees to work for their union while on the clock and being paid as a federal employee. And thousands of employees across the bureaucracy work full or part-time on this union work. At VA, for example, there's 400 employees who work full-time on taxpayer-funded union time, including medical personnel. VA's got these horrible wait lines, and they've got medical personnel who instead are processing grievances and doing other union work. For example, there was a clinic, a rural clinic with two substance use disorders counselors, drug addiction counselors. And as you can imagine, with the opioid epidemic, this is an issue. And one of those two counselors got elected to a union position on 50% union time, which meant that the clinic then had to suddenly lose a quarter of their patient care capacity for veterans. And then a few years later, this counselor got put on a 100% union time position, got a promotion in the union. And so now the clinic, to meet the patient needs, has to hire her to work overtime because she's working a full-time schedule for the union. And now they're paying her overtime to meet their patient care capacity. What in the world are you doing? I mean, we've got a huge crisis in VA, and you're wasting employees' time on basically third-party interest instead of taking care of patients and veterans who have real medical needs. And not only are you diverting people away, but you're making them less capable of doing their job. Because if you're working 100% on union business, what are you not doing? Well, you're not doing medical work. You're not doing your agency business. And so another case at VA, they had a respiratory therapist who got put on 100% union time. And then there was a bad flu season where, as happens, a number of the nurses themselves came down with the flu and certainly couldn't come in and treat patients and risk infecting them. And so they were very short-staffed, and they asked this respiratory therapist, hey, would you help us and would you put aside some of your union duties and care for patients? And she turned them down, not out of malice or greed or anything like that, but just legally, I can't treat the patients anymore. My competencies and licenses have expired. I haven't renewed them. It would be against the law for me to treat these patients. But she's getting paid as a respiratory therapist. Why are we paying employees to do a job that they've become incapable of performing? And we're also encouraging unions to file lawsuits, because any grievances they process in most agencies, few exceptions like JEDS, but in most agencies, they get to process grievances on union time. So we literally pay the unions to appeal when an agency fires a poor performer. This is nuts. This is completely nuts. And so that's why EO 13837 addresses this issue in a few ways. A bunch of things the order did, I'll just highlight three of the biggest ones. First of all, it says there's going to be a cap on union time, and any employee can spend no more than 25% of their duty hours performing non-agency business. So that is going to ensure that the vast majority, 3/4 of your duty hours, are spent doing what the agency hired you to do. And if for some reason you lose your union position, you will fully have your skills and competencies and experience that will allow you to work for the American people. This is, again, very necessary. We had a case at the Social Security Administration where one of their local union presidents, when the order was announced, promptly retired because, as he explained to SSA, I haven't processed claims for years. I would have no idea how to do that job, and I don't want to be retrained. Well, then why are you being paid by SSA as a claims processor if you can't do the job? Once the order takes effect, if it takes effect, that's not going to be an issue anymore. Everyone will be working the vast majority of their duty hours for the American people. Secondly, it directs the agencies to adopt best practices and use union time efficiently. There's a huge variation between agencies. The Defense Department, the State Department, the Interior Department, they spend about 1 hour of union time per bargaining unit employee. Other agencies spend 3, 4, 5, 6 more hours per employee. And so the order basically says, agencies, you guys are going to target the DOD and Interior and State level and get a union time rate of 1 hour or less per employee. And if you don't, you're going to report to the White House and explain to us why this is such a good use of the American people's tax dollars. So we're going to bring some efficiency into this use here. The statute provides for it, but it doesn't provide for just using it prolifically and just so wastefully. And then thirdly, we're going to prevent the use of union time for certain purposes, most notably processing grievances. If a grievance costs the unions nothing to file and is a pain to the agency, then what do you think a union is going to do, especially if they would like to be a pain to an agency? So agencies waste untold hours processing these Mickey Mouse grievances, and then we're literally paying the unions to appeal when we fire a poor performer. So enough of that. The unions will now have to use their own resources to bring grievances, and if they think it's worth spending their members' dues on, great. Then that's why we have the system, and they can do that. But if they don't think it's worth spending their members' money on, then it's certainly not worth spending the American people's money on. And we should see a lot fewer of these Mickey Mouse grievances when this order takes effect, if it takes full effect. So that's a summary of the order. So happy to talk some more about this with you, Andrew. But I think that if these are allowed to take effect, if the injunction is lifted, we're going to see a lot of benefits for the American people. And this is one of many ways that President Trump is living up to the promises that candidate Trump made 3 years ago.
Thank you very much. So I do have a few questions, and maybe we'll have time for an audience question or two. So one of the, I kind of see where you're coming from, but one issue that I think has gone through a number of our panels that I don't think has been adequately addressed is, and maybe it will be addressed by our last panel to some extent, is the broad policy question of what is the appropriate role of a public sector union, and is it just that Congress has given us a statute and we deal with that? Is there some vision? One of our earlier panelists, Elaine Kamark, mentioned that there's kind of the right tends to say public sector unions all bad, and the left seems to see them as an interest group. They're all good. Is there a way to thread a needle of here's the appropriate role for them, and this is how they ought to be treated because there's value and et cetera?
Well, I guess a few thoughts there. I mean, Congress has, as you said, passed a statute, and it's the executive branch is not the legislative branch, and so it's the job of the executive to enforce the statute as Congress has written it, and the policy question, in a sense, has been answered by Congress. But at the same time, Congress specified that the statute should be applied in a manner consistent with an effective, or the requirements of an effective and efficient government. And as we were taking a look at the many of these rules of the unions and what they're doing, we realized that that part of the congressional directive was really being ignored. You've got a right to collectively bargain was being very thoroughly enforced, but do it in a way consistent with efficient government had really fallen by the wayside. So the orders were an attempt to sort of right that balance and shift things back towards, yes, but the agencies have to run smoothly. They exist first to serve the American people, not interest group politics. I mean, one of the difficulties running through this is just the difference in how federal sector unions operate versus even state and local unions or private sector unions, in that federal sector unions, with a few exceptions, don't bargain over pay. And so what is the value proposition of the union to its members? I mean, for most unions, it's we're going to get you better pay, we're going to get you better benefits, and sometimes they do a good job of that, sometimes they don't, but that's the basic sales pitch. Join our union, we'll raise your pay. Federal unions can't make that sales pitch. Postal unions can, but most of them can't. And so what is the value proposition? Why would the federal government's all right to work, why would you pay dues? Well, the answer in large part, not exclusively, but in large part, is what the unions are selling is protection from being fired and protection from disciplinary actions. That their sales pitch is, you've got a good thing going here, and if you think the boss is going to come after you, don't you want protection? Yes, you've got statutes and protections, but we really know how to use them. We'll go to the mat. We've got our grievances, processes, and we will protect your job. And so that, I think, is why, even though the federal workforce writ large is just headed up to here with the poor performers and would love to see them fired, the federal sector unions reacted like Dracula in front of a garlic lover's pizza when we came out with the orders. I mean, the polling showed that they were popular with the feds, but the unions who purport to speak for the feds were horrified by them. And the way you square that circle is understanding that the people who join the union and pay dues, it's only about 20% in the federal sector, are basically the poor performers that the other 80% of the federal workforce is annoyed with. That's a broad brush. I mean, there's plenty of hardworking and diligent members of federal sector unions, but on balance, the people who are attracted to the union's sales pitch are the people who think their agency might want to fire them, and that's why the unions just go nuts anytime you have a mention of performance pay or performance-based removals or anything like that, because they are being paid by their members to prevent that from happening. So that is a challenge, and again, part of why are we taking the grievances or trying to take the grievances out of the or removals out of the grievance process is because you've just created a system where it's all around protecting the poor performers, and that's not what Congress called for. That's not how Congress directed that the statute should be interpreted. That's not what most federal employees want, and let's take care of that.
Right, that's helpful. So it kind of does sound, though, that, and this is my characterization, not necessarily yours, that part of the view, it is kind of dialectical. Mm-hmm. We're resetting where things were before. There may not be a theory of exactly precisely what the role for a public sector union is, but we know it's not over here. Yeah. It kind of should be over here, and maybe the next administration will continue that dialogue. Yeah, I mean, and again, there's some federal sector unions that are doing pretty good job. I mean, the ICE and the Customs and Border Patrol unions have very high membership. It's about 90%. I mean,
those unions are not simply the poor performers looking for protection. There's a real crisis on the border, and particularly in the last administration, a lot of the ICE and CBP agents had a lot of concerns with how the last administration was addressing it. And I think part of the support for the union was an expression of no confidence in the Obama administration's handling of that crisis. So there are, certainly, but that's something you can't then generalize to every agency. So there's a need for some sort of across the board rules here, and then some agency specific approaches, and what works in one agency may not work in another.
We've seen a lot in the news about the perceived need for independence of the civil service, and that independence is also one of the justifications for Chevron deference. We say that agencies are neutral and expert within their realm, and they're sort of insulated from politics. And I also hear often that people say part of the reason why civil servants have this job protection, and now this is more just generally talking about job protections, is that the pay is lower, and so there's a trade-off there. So I guess, do you have views on how independent or politically accountable, is there a role for the unfireability or the difficulty of firing by agency heads or by the president? I'm not saying call for the repeal of Pendleton or the removal of...
I'll take those questions in reverse order.
Sure.
I mean, first of all, it's simply the case that federal employees make more on average than private sector workers would. The Congressional Budget Office had a report that came out, I think, a year or two ago, and they found that the average federal employee gets 3% higher cash wages and 48% higher benefits than the comparable private sector worker. On net, it's about a 17% overall compensation premium. So that you may have had a pay penalty in the past, but right now it's a pay premium. With the asterisk that that's an average figure, and there's plenty of federal employees who could make as much or more in the private sector, but across the entire bureaucracy. So in terms of, you need the job security as a trade-off for low compensation, that's just not the case. Now, in terms of the independence of the civil service, I mean, there were real problems that were being addressed by, say, the Pendleton Act, but a lot of that was around the hiring process. And you worked on the campaign, come on in. Here's a patronage job for you. Oh, you're my nephew. Oh, come on in. Glad to do you a solid. And so I think there's a real reason and need for merit screening and ensuring all the rules that you have against patronage and stuff stay in place. And it's certainly appropriate that you have political appointees and that politics play a role in how some people are hired, but how your say average IRS tax agent is hired, probably that should not be based on political connections or working on the campaign or what have you, or who you know. But that's a completely separate question from the removal protections. And I don't think you can protect the independence through the hiring process and the merit system's hiring process, but that's a world away from saying that it should be a 6 month to a year and a half knockdown drag out fight to remove a federal employee. Because you might prevent a few firings that shouldn't have happened from happening, but you're preventing an awful lot of firings that should happen from happening in the same case. And you've got to be concerned about those, the lack of action hurting federal agencies. I mean, federal employees themselves, year after year, this is the #1 pain point on the Fed survey, is agency failure to address poor performers. Federal employees are fed up with it, the managers are fed up, and the president's fed up with it. We've got to do better.
Mm-hmm. So last year we had this Lucia case, which dealt with the need under the Constitution for certain SEC ALJs to be appointed by agency heads. I guess I'm wondering, is there a similar principle? I mean, as a matter of legal policy, it's my understanding that lots of agency heads delegate and subdelegate CBA negotiations, and that a lot of these, there's your big CBA, but then there are these sub CBAs that are pursuant to the original CPA that are site specific. Someone's mentioning 1,200 different sites, bargaining units at DOD, and I'm sure even within those there are sub units. You may have a site and you may be negotiating over who's on duty, Tuesday, Thursday, and how many hours. We're talking a heck of a lot of negotiations that go on. Is there an administrability problem here with requiring, ought these all be required to go to agency head? How much makes sense in terms of delegation?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. Because under the statute, you've got agency head review, but it's only for legality. The agency head is not taking a review of the contract and saying, hey, do we think this is good policy? Will this help us to operate efficiently and effectively? It's purely, does anything in this contract violate the law? If so, ka-chunk. This was a stupid provision. Why did you agree to this? Oh, well, I can't stop that. And that's an interesting question when you've got the people who are negotiating these contracts, for the most part, are not going to be someone to be categorized as an officer of the United States, but they're required under Chapter 71 to have the authority to bind the agency. That if the lower level guys agree to this, then you can't say, oh, we ran it up the chain and the High Command said we can't do that anymore. They have to be fully authorized negotiators or it's bad faith bargaining. So that is a interesting question. I'm not a lawyer. I have not myself delved into that, but certainly there's an argument to be made that if you're going to have the authority to bind the agency, that it ought to be someone in a position of accountability within the agency, and someone who's directly accountable to the agency head rather than whoever in like local base commander somewhere or whatever it is. I mean, if you're going to bind your agency, there needs to be accountability for the exercise of that power.
Right, right. And I had mentioned in my opening remarks on the first panel, it does seem to me, I wasn't at DOT at the time, but it did seem to me like part of the reason that the shutdown sort of ended early was LaGuardia's slowdown, which dealt with a lot of watch schedules that are set at the very local level. And at that point, you've got very low-level employees who are kind of handling high-level policy. So I guess we'll open it for maybe one or two questions if there are any. I'll start over here with Tammy. And then
I know you're not a lawyer, James. I have not been able to read, what was it, a 120-page decision on the injunction by the D.C. District Court. Could you talk a little bit more about the reasoning and how the administration is, the arguments on the appeal? Mm-hmm. In particular, could you comment on, she seemed to be saying that anything that would interfere with bargaining, statutory bargaining rights, you can't do, the president can't do, and I was just wondering whatever happened to constitutional executive power.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Happy to talk about that. I mean, obviously, any executive order that gets issued goes through Office of Legal Counsel review, where very, very smart lawyers in the Justice Department take a look, and these things were vetted to a T, and obviously they passed OLC review. And so OLC did not take the same view of the Chapter 71 obligations as the district court judge did. The short summary of what she held is that these orders impose government-wide rules and requirements, such as 25% cap on official time, such as PIPs can be no more than 30 days. Because you're doing this, you take away the ability of the unions to bargain for more than whatever this rule has set, and therefore that contravenes their collective bargaining rights. The statute says they can collectively bargain. Now, there's two problems with that. One would be the constitutional issue of, can Congress basically micromanage the president like that and take away his core executive power? Now, we didn't even have to reach that determination because the statute expressly says don't worry about it. And if a government-wide rule or regulation supersedes collective bargaining and you don't have any obligation or entitlement or even permission to bargain over a government-wide rule or regulation. And there's a huge string of case law, tons of DC Circuit cases, and other sector cases that all say, yes, when you have a government-wide rule, you can't bargain over it, and there's no obligation to bargain in good faith. And so it was a interesting leap of logic for the judge to, in not very much space, basically say, yeah, it doesn't apply here. If you're directly regulating the subjects of collective bargaining, then this exception can't be invoked. Well, everything regulates a subject of collective bargaining if you have a government-wide rule. So that's on appeal. I personally doubt that the DC Circuit will reach the merits of that question, although I think on the merits it's a slam dunk case, because just jurisdictionally, Congress set up the framework so that you have to bring any claim violation of the statute before the Federal Labor Relations Authority, and then once the FLRA has weighed in, then you can appeal to the DC Circuit. And the courts have repeatedly held, including the Supreme Court, that when Congress has this sort of agency review statute, you can't go outside that and proceed directly to district court. So that's what the DC Circuit spent most of their argument time focusing on and the questions on. I think it's clearly the legally correct answer that you've got to bring it before the administrative forum before you can appeal to the courts. You do get your day in court, but the agency gets to weigh in first, and the courts evaluate the ruling on the issue in light of the Chevron deference owed to an agency interpretation of its statute. So my suspicion is, but I'm not the judge, I don't know, I wish I knew. But my suspicion is the decision will focus on the these sort of jurisdictional issues. But if they were to reach the merits, I think 5 U.S.C. 7117A1 expressly says that collective bargaining does not touch a government-wide rule or regulation. These are, an executive order is by definition a government-wide rule. So the logic was not the same, that the judge followed was not the same process that OLC gave when they were reviewing these.
Yeah, and just one note on that. So I did read the entire decision, and it just struck me as the judgment was a little bit odd, because it seemed like an agency could independently make their own determination, set their own policy, and do the exact same thing. And the real problem is that the president ordered it. So, I don't know. Anyways, I will have time for one more question. So,
I think what you're doing is great. But, and I understand, an executive order you can do quickly, all right? And there's political reasons to do it. But why not at least a backup change in the regulation, the CFR? I mean, I basically rewrote the whole Federal Labor Relations statute by that.
So you're correct, and the executive order called for OPM to change the regulations, and we have an injunction in place. And so you might imagine that lawyers would not smile if we were to issue an NPRM implementing enjoined portions of an executive order, that could be considered contempt of court. And even if we disagree with the logic underlying the judicial holding, they have the authority to issue it. And until a reviewing court lifts such injunction, we're not allowed to issue regulations or begin the process of issuing regulations that would fly in the face of the injunction. So
we'll take George, and then we'll...
But yeah, the order expressly called for OPM issue regulations, putting all this in there.
Good reason to keep OPM too, by the way.
Well, obviously, I
comment.
support the reorganization plan, and there's a lot of real problems we're trying to address in that.
Yeah, I'd like to just make a comment about the vagaries of the district court. Back in 2005, the unions took the National Security Personnel System, the regulations, to court and got an injunction against their implementation. The first judge was previously a labor lawyer, now a judge, decided that the notion of not bargaining over those regulations, given their impact on the union labor force, was a violation of the principle of collective bargaining, and hence those regulations could not go into effect. Well, the statute that created NSPS and authorized those regulations specifically exempted DOD and OPM from collective bargaining and defined the role in statute to be one of consultation and not bargaining. That apparently escaped the judge altogether, so the ruling was appealed. Second judge, also a former labor lawyer, concurred with the initial decision, arguing that citing labor laws, which are irrelevant in the federal sector. Chapter 71 basically overrides all other statutes on labor and is very specific to the federal workforce. Totally ignored that little detail. So it wasn't until it was taken up on appeal to the circuit court a year and a half later that we finally won, and the unions dropped the case after that because they knew that basically their gambit had been lost. But yeah, that's the vagaries of the district court, and you can be hopeful on more reasonable reviews higher up.
Wait it out. Well, please join me in thanking James for his remarks and for joining us. Thank you so much.